Hustle culture. The British have to be the original hustlers. Coming with deals but taking everything. Rice fields, royal jewels, taxes, textiles, nothing was off limits. And a fun fact, the word loot, that was stolen from India too. Beneath the empire's shine lies a story untold. Treasures taken, industry shattered, pride stolen. He is here to expose it all. How are you today? Are you ready?
I think so. Ready to roll.
Okay, lovely. Are you ready, guys?
Roll camera. Action.
Wit, wisdom, and a war on historical amnesia. The very wise Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Welcome.
Thank you.
Our episode Loot, it has to start with the Kohinoor, the timeless symbol of British loot. In some of our biggest Bollywood movies, they've tried to steal the Kohinoor back. Maybe because it's a collective fantasy. But Shashi, real talk, if Britain actually gave us the Kohinoor back, would it bring us closure?
Not really, no. I think it would be symbolic more than anything else, which it already is in many ways. I mean, the Kohinoor, you think about it, is something which had already an image and legend. The very name, Kohinoor, means mountain of light. And it was a name that was given because it was considered the most fabulous diamond in the world. It wasn't the largest, but there's something resplendent about it, according to everybody who ever possessed it or talked about it. And it was considered very important for the British to persuade the youngest son of the Leaps, of Ranjit Singh, to actually hand over the Kohinoors to the Queen as kind of a gesture of fealty to her. And it's striking. First of all, the Kohinoor then was whittled down by the British. It's actually today much smaller than the Kohinoor of Indian legend. The original Kohinoor was actually in the temple of Bhadrakali in what's today Andhra Pradesh. It was mined in Golconda. And then it got looted by Alauddin Khilji in the 13th century and has moved on thereafter through many hands, but finally ended up in Punjab, in Lahore, the Sikh kingdom, and then was given, quote unquote, to the British. So the British always often argue it was given to us, it wasn't looted by us. But you know, you point a gun at my head and say, give me your wallet. It doesn't really mean I've given you my wallet, right? The moment you put the gun away, I want my wallet back, so we want the Kohinoor back too. But as it happens, what the Kohinoor represents is a much larger idea. There's so many invaluable artifacts that the British have taken from our country. Take something like the so-called Amravati marbles, exquisite stupas that were dismantled and carried away. Take the famous Tipu Sultan artifact of a tiger mauling a British soldier. You find that in the Victoria and Albert Museum today. I mean, these are all things which in many ways represented what India could do and did cherish. And they've been taken away as symbols of colonial triumph and victory. I've sometimes joked that the Hindi word loot was taken by the British into their dictionaries as well as their habits. Many English people don't realize that the word is actually not of Anglo-Saxon or even Norman or Latin origin. It's from Hindi. And they picked it up in India along with the habits. Robert Clive, in particular, was such a great exponent of loot, and he was the first of the great thieves who ruled us, in his case, in the mid-18th century. So we've got a long history. Yes, there is a feeling that many of these stolen objects should be returned. And there have been some gestures, for example, the throne of the Ashantis, the British had taken away from Ghana, has been given back to the Ashanti tribe. It's like a stool, but it's a symbolic throne. I think the people of Benin have got something back as well, and Namibia, if I'm not mistaken, has got something from the Germans. The more famous examples are all the Nazi loot, particularly of Jewish properties, precious paintings, and other art and so on that was taken by the Nazis. Those have all been systematically returned. But colonial loot, people are much more reluctant to give. I mean, when the then Prime Minister David Cameron came to India and somebody asked him, will you return these things? He said, no, I'm sorry. If we give it to you, then the entire British Museum will soon be empty. And this is a problem they've got, that pretty much every museum in London is a chor bazaar, a sort of thieves market, except that it's not a market. They've already taken it without paying for it, and it's there, and it's theirs. Every time you pay entrance fee to a British museum, it's essentially they're saying, come and pay us money to see what our grandfather took from your grandfather. I mean, that's really what's going on.
Now, the internet is buzzing and people are asking why exactly was India the empire's jewel in the crown?
Oh, for every possible reason. It was the most rich, the largest, in every respect, contributor to the great glory, quote unquote, of the British Empire. The amount of loot taken from India, the financial resources, the fact that Indian taxes paid for the entire British Indian army of colonial occupation. They conquered places from Aden all the way to Hong Kong using Indian soldiers paid for by Indian tax money. They contributed enormous amounts of resources to the British Exchequer, the so-called home charges system, which meant that every single paise spent by the British for their salaries, their pensions, their own expenses, even interest on whatever money they sent to India, everything was paid for out of Indian revenues. So they drained and drained and drained. Nobody else could have done that. It then also became the biggest markets in the world for British goods. They had a captive market. They controlled the market, and they came and sold their goods to us. And of course, they charged us more than they would have got anywhere else. And they paid us next to nothing for what they took from us. So the jewel in the crown is because we actually enriched Britain. The moment they lost that jewel, the moment they lost India, the glory of the British Empire subsided like a punctured balloon.
Now, author and historian William Dalrymple, in his book Anarchy, he calls the East India Company a rogue multinational with shady investors and a private army. Now, was that the real source of their power behind looting India?
But one thing I will say is that the East India Company actually had a larger army than the British Crown. So they had not only white soldiers and officers, but they also had a heck of a lot of Indian sepoys, quote unquote, who served them, whom they paid pittance to. I think if I remember right, the British soldiers doing exactly the same work got 5 times the salary as the Indians. So even the soldiers who built their empire were exploited. And the East India Company was like a great mafia operation. You know, the mafia would go to somebody who has a nice property or a shop or whatever, or even a restaurant, and say, oh, what a nice place. What a pity it would be if it were completely wrecked and vandalized. And the owner would say, but no one's going to vandalize it. And the mafia says, oh, we might, unless you pay us protection money, then we'll protect it for you. The British did exactly that. They would actually go to rajas of little principalities, big zamindars, and even sometimes in due course larger sort of domains, and say to them, you need protection. And they'd say, from whom? And they'd say, from us. And we're going to station our troops here, and you're going to pay for it. And you're also going to pay us a tribute, and then you're going to give us all of that. Otherwise, who knows what might happen to you? And the Rajas learned very quickly these guys had the bigger and better guns, and the trained musketeers, and the trained artillery, and so on. So you better give them what they want. It was a large-scale mafia operation conducted on the soil of India at our expense.
Now, editor Utpal Kumar, he points out that during Warren Hastings' rule, a brutal famine, it wiped out whole villages in Bengal, but Hastings unabashedly bragged about not cutting taxes.
Yeah.
How do you see that?
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. They were horrifyingly cruel because the Indian tradition before the British came had always been of certain flexibility and all these things. Okay, you have to give us some revenue, you had a death in the family, your daughter is sick, or you have a wedding that you're spending money on or whatever. The rent collector says, "Theek hai, give it to us later." that was the kind of system. Or we'll skip it this year. Doesn't matter. Next year, when your harvest is better, give us more. This kind of approach was the Indian way. The British did everything by the book. If your rate was this, first of all, they raised the rates. They had the most cruelly high rates of taxation on revenue, far more than most people could afford. They actually drove people to near starvation and penury through their taxes. But they also made no exceptions. It didn't matter if you had an illness, a drought, a famine, a wedding, anything. You just had to pay, and you didn't pay, you were tortured in the most excruciating manner, in a very public way. And the tortures were often not just of men, but even of women and children, publicly. I think I mentioned how in the impeachment of Warren Hastings that took place in the House of Commons, one of the things was all these horrible stories of how the East India Company used to extract money. Some of them were so gruesome and awful that the wife of the playwright Sheridan, Robert Sheridan, fainted in the House of Commons, a famously celebrated incident, when she heard how horribly these people were behaving towards the poor Indian peasants. It really was cruelty on top of extraction. Loot was never innocent, it was painful.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are some figures that suggest that during British rule, 12 famines, they killed up to 80 million.
No, larger than that, larger than.
And, well, then do you think it's time to maybe stop sugarcoating the British colonialism, so to say, and call it for what it was, a genocide?
Yeah, I mean, genocide is a 20th century word, and I think in some ways it reflects a 20th century sensibility. But de facto, that's what it boiled down to. Because if you take Bengal, for example, in the late 1760s to 1770s, the population of Bengal was about 30 million. 10 million, that is 1/3 of the entire population, died in that famine. There were other famines. There was a famine in Odisha, which killed again a large percentage of the population. And what was amazing about the Brits was their indifference to human suffering. They continued extracting not only money, but even crops. So they would take grain from starving people and ship it off to England. Unbelievable cruelty. And on top of that, they didn't believe in charity. The whole prevailing culture in those days in England, and therefore by English rulers in India, was that charity merely encouraged idleness. And therefore people were starving to death, you're not supposed to feed them. This is the kind of attitude that prevailed in that horrible system. And the famines were created by British policy. You mustn't assume, as British seem to do, and they managed to convince the world, that India was perpetually a land of famine. There were practically no famines because there was a culture of charity. There was a drought. No one did all these cruel things of exacting revenue. Maharajas, zamindars came and gave aid. There were collective sort of kitchens to make rice, khichdi or whatever, and serve to the people. The entire culture was different. The British abolished all of that. They were in charge and they didn't believe in all of this. So these famines were caused by a whole series of British policies. These were British-made famines. And right up to the late 19th century, the British were indifferent. Then there was a certain raising of conscience because the British themselves, first of all, popular press freedom started around the mid-19th century. The British needed to justify their colonialism in the eyes of their own people, and more people getting educated, more people were demanding to know what was going on, why they were doing it. So they invented this myth of the civilizing mission. And that means they had to show that they were there for the benefit of the Indians, even though amongst themselves they knew perfectly well, and their notes exchanged, saying, this is all talk, we know why we are here. But that acting for the benefit of the Indians meant they couldn't ignore famines anymore. So they created these famine relief camps, which were actually work camps. The poor starving Indians had to work for their relief. And the quantity of rations given, as has been pointed out by British scholars later, was lower than the rations given by Hitler's Nazis to the Jews in Buchenwald, who were going to be killed in the concentration camps. That was the condition in which these poor Indians were shoved into these horrible, horrible relief camps.
So it's just a theory, but if it wasn't for the empire, if the British were not here, then maybe India could have got support from its neighbors, for example, and they could have handled the famine themselves.
There wouldn't have been famines in the first place. That's my point. But if at all there had been very severe droughts, let's say 2 failed monsoons in a row or whatever, then they would have done charity for themselves. I mean, that's essentially it. We were not a country that allowed people to die like that. It just wasn't there. And I think we forget because, unfortunately, the image of India painted in the minds of most people is the image inculcated by British publicity and propaganda from the 19th century onwards. Oh, it's a country of poor people. People are constantly dying. They're always sick. They're poor. You know, that's how they are. That's how they've always been. I'm sorry, that wasn't. Where did the Sone Ki Chiriya talk come from, the golden bird that was India? It was a prosperous country. And the fact is that there is no doubt that we wouldn't have needed any help from neighbors. First of all, who would our neighbors have been? What would India have been? I've argued, for example, that almost certainly, if there had been no European colonization of India, there would have been probably something very similar to what happened in Japan, where the Marathas would have conquered most of the country as a military sort of system, like the shoguns in Japan. And that's exactly what they were doing, by the way, before they were stopped by the British at one side and by the Afghans at the other. And they would probably have prevailed. At one point, the Mughal emperor was essentially a hostage of the Marathas, but they kept him on the throne because they wanted this kind of symbolic figurehead. So it would have been just like Japan, a constitutional monarch. A monarch, the real power was with the military shoguns, and the monarch was the symbol of the country. That would have happened with us. We would have had these Marathas as a kind of military caste, if you like. You'd have had the Mughal emperor as a kind of presiding deity. And eventually, this would have evolved into democracy, as is done everywhere else in the 20th century. We would have been no exception. And that's how probably India would have been. Now, this India would have been a very rich and prosperous country. It would not, certainly not, have been sort of needing help from neighbors or whatever. On the contrary.
What if the British never colonized us? It's a question people are asking on the internet. Would the subcontinent still have commanded 30% of the world's economy as it once had?
No, we were not quite 30. According to the famous study of Angus Madison, it was more like 27 at its peak.
Which isn't bad.
Well, not bad at all. That's more than the US commands of the global economy today. But look, countries grow and rise, and others would also have been prospering. I don't think any one country could have stayed put like that. The Chinese had gone up to as high as 27 also when we were down to 23. And then they went a long way down, and now they're rising again. The US didn't even exist 200 years ago when all these figures were to be calculated by Angus Madison, the famous British econometric historian who did this global GDP calculation going back to the birth of Christ and before. And frankly, today, and indeed even earlier, after the Second World War, the US was richer than most of the countries in the world put together. So things would have gone up and down. I'm not saying we would have permanently been at the top, but we would not have been racked by poverty, pestilence, disease, illiteracy, all the horrors that the British inflicted upon us.
Now, after the latest numbers are coming about GDP and economic growth, and there are a lot of comparisons between India and the Great Britain. Do they hold?
Well, we've just overtaken the British, as you probably know, in terms of overall GDP. The per capita, obviously, they're still way ahead of us. They're, about 70-odd million people, and we are 1.4 billion. But the fact is that these are completely sort of hypothetical, speculative theories. Britain, in many ways, is the product of its empire. It is what it is today and what it became in the 19th and early 20th centuries because it had an empire to exploit. So if there was no empire, would Britain even be where it is today? Probably not. It certainly wasn't. At the time that the East India Company was first formed, it was nowhere close to being the principal power in Europe, let alone in the world. So all these speculations, you can have hypotheticals in every direction, Richa.
This may be an emotional one. Writer Sadat Hussain Manto once said that when a man is robbed of everything, the only thing that he doesn't lose is his accent. Now, the British looted our Kohinoor, but there's a belief that they also, in a sense, looted our confidence, our culture, our self-belief.
Yeah, in fact, there is actually an anecdote which I've read from the 1920s when the then Prince of Wales was visiting India. And of course, he was taken to all the good things, the fancy railway station, the carriage, the prosperous places and that. And he turned to the Indian official accompanying him and said, "Look what the British have done for you, and look at all this sort of, what are you lacking here?" And the man had the courage to say, "Self-respect, Your Majesty." I mean, that really is the problem. They robbed us of our self-respect. They robbed us of our honor. And it took some time to build that back because, part of the mythologizing of empire, this whole nonsense about the civilizing mission, this whole nonsense about their being there for our good, all of that led to a self-perception on the part of Indians that these people were somehow superior to all of us. There are a couple of stories I can tell you. I mean, there's, the cricketer Ranji was a prince, Prince Ranjit Singh Ji. When he went to England, he was absolutely stunned to see dockyard workers as the ship landed who were white. He said, how can these white people be doing low-caste work? And he was hastily assured by his British escort, oh, they're only Irishmen. There's another story of an official as late as the 1920s traveling to England from India and being shocked to see shoeshine boys who were English. He thought that he could not imagine a white person in anything other than a superior profession. He thought that everywhere, including in Britain, they were all Lard Sahibs, they were all lords. That was the kind of extent to which the British had convinced us to think of them as somehow superior class apart. And they weren't. They were just like anybody else. And we, sadly, were fooled into thinking otherwise for a very long time.
Now, true or false, India's military spending was largely driven by British colonial interests, and India would have spent less on defense if it had not been colonized.
Yeah, that's true because the colonial expenditure on defense was for the expansion of the British Empire. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we were actually sending Indian soldiers from everywhere from Aden to Hong Kong. We were conquering the world for the British at our expense, mind you. We had to pay, not just for our own soldiers, but for their soldiers, their officers, and so on. The British Indian Army was a major instrument of British exploitation and imperial expansion, whereas India never had any interest in expansion. I mean, our vision, any monarch you can look at for 3,000 years, the maximum vision was the classic subcontinental picture of the mountains and the seas. It was within that they wanted to conquer. No one had any ambitions to go off and conquer China or Persia or whatever. In fact, the Persians came and attacked us. There's no record of any Indian king ever attacking Persia. So I think you have to see, we would not have been spending this kind of money on external defense. Plus, in the kind of scenario I was talking to you about, if the Marathas had consolidated their rule throughout the country, they would essentially have also become, like everybody else, a little complacent, a little fat, a little comfortable. They would not have needed to keep on fighting wars. No one wants to keep on fighting, right? I mean, no soldiers want to keep on fighting either after a point. And I think that you would have seen they would have been strong enough to protect their borders, and they would have been relaxed enough not to need further expansion. I think the limits of their ambitions would have been the same as those of the Emperor Ashoka, all the various Aurangzeb, and so on. Let's control everything from the Himalayas to the seas, and the whole subcontinental peninsula and Hindi heartland. That would have been the extent of their ambition. So I don't think they would have needed to spend anything like what the British made us spend.
The UK was vastly richer than India prior to British colonizing India. True or false?
False. Completely false. There's a lovely book by a woman called Alex von Tunzelmann called Indian Summer, which she has a chapter where she talks about how poor Britain was and the terrible conditions of poverty in which most of the British were sunk. Not to mention that they were not a terribly well-civilized land either. I mean, yes, they had finally found Shakespeare, as it were, by the late 16th century. But this is a culture where people bathed once a week, where large numbers of people died in the plague in the 17th century and so on. It was not exactly what you would think of as a developed country, let alone a prosperous one. And as I've mentioned in another episode, the revenues of the Indian emperor at the time, about 1700, Aurangzeb, exceeded those of all the crowned heads of Europe put together. From the king in Versailles in Paris, outside Paris, to the British Empire, British wasn't an empire yet, the British crown, to all the other European countries, put them all together, and their revenues were less than Aurangzeb's. There is simply nonsense to suggest that the British were wealthier than India, far from it. In fact, they came to India because they wanted some of our wealth. India was a place where they could make money. That's why they came.
But a lot of people want to understand, was the Indian subcontinent so easy to conquer?
Yeah, unfortunately. We've talked about this also in another episode. The fact is that the Mughal emperor, the last sort of really powerful, effective, and even he had overstretched himself was Aurangzeb. After that, there was a steady decline in the ability of the emperor to control his empire. His various appointees to the provinces became kings themselves, and Nawabs, and Nizams, and Maharajas, and there was a fragmentation. And of course, when you no longer have one large mighty thing, people start fighting amongst themselves. Others start attacking, whether it's the Rohillas coming like bandits or the Marathas coming to conquer more territory, whatever. People were fighting each other. And that kind of disunity gave an opportunity for a well-organized military force like the British to step in. Even that was a very slow process. We've talked about that, how they started off with these little so-called factories in the ports, mainly for trading purposes. Then to protect the factories, they were able to bring people with troops and guns and so on. Then they hired locally and they started expanding. And then the turning point in many ways, which all historians would agree, was the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Pilashi, where what the triumph of Robert Clive ensured was that Bengal, this large, rich province in the large sort of eastern part of the Mughal Empire, suddenly became theirs, de facto theirs. I mean, they were still a Nawab, but they replaced Siraj-ud-Dawla, whom they defeated in Plassey, with Mir Jafar, his treacherous cousin, and there was a lot of treachery and mutual backstabbing and other Indian quality. They got a firman from the emperor to collect the revenue, and that was that. No looking back from there. Clive robbed so much that he actually said, I marvel at my self-restraint in not having stolen even more than I did. He got Mir Jafar to give him a tribute in those days of 234,000 pounds sterling, which is today about 40 million pounds.
Yeah.
That's just one tribute. He would walk into treasuries of Rajas and literally help himself to any jewels, any gold, anything he wanted. He bought himself a seat in Parliament, a rotten borough. He bought himself manor. I mean, he had nothing. He was actually a very middle-class, lower middle-class kind of guy before he came out to India. He became this hugely rich fellow on the backs of his loot in India. And the British had the gall to call him Clive of India, as if he belonged to the country, when all he really did was ensure that much of the country belonged to him. This is the kind of thing that kept happening with the British. And I'm afraid there is no doubt that our disunity, our internal quarrels, our willingness to betray each other for profit, all of that contributed. And some of it was financed, I'm afraid, by Indian capital. So the Jagat Seths, who were little merchant bankers, it is estimated that at their peak, the Jagat Seths actually controlled more capital than the Bank of England. But the fact is, these guys lent money to the British because they didn't like Siraj-ud-Dawla. Because Siraj-ud-Dawla had done something bad to them or betrayed them or not paid back a loan. I've forgotten the details. And so they decided, let's finance the British to conquer this guy and get him out of the way.
Shashi, many thanks for speaking to us.
Thank you, Runji.
Pleasure.
The loot is not just about riches. The British stole our self-respect, our industry, our confidence. They rewrote the rules to keep us down. It's time we reclaim what was taken, starting with the truth.